To prove the truth of gravity, 2 elementary school students threw a brick down a building every day. This absurd act resulted in a young boy passing by being struck on the head and killed. When they presented this ridiculous explanation to the judge declared them innocent. According to South Korea's juvenile protection law, minors under 14 years old cannot be convicted of criminal offenses. Therefore, just 3 minutes after the trial began, the 2 villains were acquitted. Even more horrifying, they showed no remorse whatsoever. In fact, as they left the courtroom, they even smirked triumphantly at the victim's mother. The juvenile protection law, intended to help misguided teenagers repent, had become a protective charm for these evil individuals. The victim's father, seeing his wife weeping in distress, tried to comfort her. That's just how the law works. The court's concession was to protect the children. But would mere tolerance truly lead to their repentance and change? That possibility is almost non-existent, because in the face of harsh reality, idealism is so fragile that it shatters at the slightest touch. 5 years later, those 2 devils committed another crime. They took a young girl to a deserted construction site after she fell asleep, then called 4 accomplices, and together they sexually assaulted the victim. The tolerance of their crime 5 years ago ultimately sowed the seeds for the growth of evil. It wasn't until the next morning that Seon-ah, completely naked, was discovered by a worker. She was unconscious and covered in bruises from the rape. Fortunately, the worker called the police in time, saving her life. Because she had been drugged with alcohol, Seon-ah only vaguely remembered what happened the night before. She only remembers about 3 people assaulting her. But before the police could even begin their investigation, Seon-ah was subjected to online psychological abuse with the most vile language. They constantly claimed that she was the guilty party, that there's no smoke without fire. This made Seon-ah, already severely traumatized, even more unable to bear the humiliation. Ultimately, she decided to end her pregnancy. Fortunately, her father discovered it in time and saved his daughter. Unable to contain his anger, he personally confronted In-jun, the man who had lured his daughter out. But the evil man not only refused to apologize, but brazenly claimed that they had obtained Seon-ah's consent before the act, making it a consensual encounter. Initially, they planned to find a random spot by the roadside, but considering the possibility of being discovered, they went to a construction site instead. They even played a game of guessing numbers while taking turns assaulting Seon-ah. In-jun proudly told Seon-ah's father that the 2 older brothers had played with his daughter in various positions first. Then it was his turn, but because he was drunk, he couldn't do anything. Furthermore, even though Seon-ah was drunk, she resisted fiercely, making him very regretful. Seon-ah's father scolded In-jun, calling him crazy, but he remained smug, saying that since he was her father, he couldn't understand the pleasure they felt. Seon-ah's father couldn't take it anymore, and finally beat In-jun. However, because he assaulted a minor, he was locked up in a detention center. Even more ironically, the audio recording of In-jun's confession was deemed fabricated evidence because he was forced to do it and therefore couldn't be used in court. Finally, the case was transferred to Un-soo. When the judge of the juvenile court saw In-jun's name and personal information, Un-soo suddenly trembled. She was completely unable to control her emotions, and finally, unable to stand any longer, she fainted. It turned out she was the mother who had lost her child 5 years ago. After that absurd trial, Un-soo resolved to become a juvenile judge and dedicate her life to judging those devils disguised as angels. Now, she had finally achieved her wish. She couldn't easily forgive the perpetrator of the case from years ago. After regaining consciousness, she immediately returned to the court. According to In-jun's one-sided testimony, he was actually just following orders from 2 others. Initially, they only intended to take Seon-ah out for drinks and had no intention of doing anything inappropriate. Moreover, he didn't join them in assaulting Seon-ah. He even tried to stop their criminal act, but was pushed away by the 2 drunk men. In the end, he just wandered around the construction site, waiting for the 2 men to leave. Later, the court announced that only the DNA of the other 2 suspects was found in Seon-ah's body, and they had both definitively confessed to their crimes. Because both were already 14 years old, the case would be investigated and processed under juvenile criminal law a few days later. However, Yoon-soo doubted the verdict and intended to investigate secretly. Unexpectedly, her ex-husband, who had divorced her 5 years earlier, suddenly showed up. She thought he would help her, but instead, he threatened her with legal arguments, demanding that she avoid getting involved in the case because she was related to the victim from years ago. Un-soo indifferently asked her husband on what basis he should interfere in her affairs. She asked what he meant by the situation. He replied that since he was the girl's father, she should take revenge on him. He said that doing so wouldn't change anything and that she would ultimately be the one hurt. But Un-soo insisted that she didn't care. He should just open his eyes wide and see. In-jun would definitely receive the harshest punishment. 3 days later, the trial opened, but Un-soo didn't call the suspect suspect immediately, instead calling In-jun. Besides repeating his previous testimony, In-jun also said that he was threatened by the two older guys, which is why he helped them do bad things, and that he didn't actually want to do it. The lawyer even presented several photos of his injuries as evidence. The lawyer said that the case stemmed from an unfair power relationship. He knew Dong Jian and Gong Su outside of school, and for a long time he had to buy cigarettes or alcohol for them. Disobeying them would result in a beating. But Yun-soo shrewdly noticed the contradictions in In-jun's earlier and later statements. If he was truly terrified of those two older brothers and always obeyed them without question, why did he dare to speak up and stop them on the night of the crime? Hearing this, In-jun was stunned. Yun-soo continued to question why he dared to disobey them only this time. At that moment, the lawyer stood up to defend him, saying that time, In-jun was indeed very afraid of the threats and beatings from the older brothers. But before she could finish her sentence, In-jun spoke up himself. He sobbed, saying that this incident was unacceptable. How could they, as fellow human beings, commit such a brutal crime? If it were someone else, they might have been deceived by his innocent appearance, but Yun-soo knew the true shameless nature of this scoundrel. She gave In-jun one last chance to tell the truth, otherwise she would judge him severely. But he still refused to admit anything, so Yun-soo reluctantly called a witness to appear in court. This person is also the police officer in charge of investigating this case. The two had met 3 days prior. At that time, Yun-soo suspected that besides the killer's DNA, there was other evidence. So taking advantage of the deserted late night, she went to the crime scene. She encountered the contractor who came to the construction site every night and parked his car there. She also received a video recording of the events that night from his car's dash cam. The video showed a group of people drinking alcohol and deliberately getting Sona drunk. After Sona became completely intoxicated, the group laughed obscenely, preparing to sexually assault her. The entire scene was recorded very clearly by the dash cam. The truth is that all three of them, including In-jun, took turns assaulting Sona. Furthermore, In-jun acted maliciously from the beginning and was not forced as he initially claimed. This time, he finally couldn't deny it anymore. However, In-jun's lawyer continued to try to deny it, claiming that the dash cam footage was likely fabricated. But at this point, the police officer presented documents provided by the court's video analysis department to prove the authenticity of the video, asserting that the footage extracted from the dash cam showed no signs of tampering. Ultimately, due to providing false testimony, In-jun was identified as an accomplice. He would be transferred to a juvenile criminal case for further investigation. Furthermore, the investigation would be completed within a week, after which the sentencing hearing would be held. But before the trial date, Judge Tae-ju rushed in a panic. It turned out he had just found a new clue from another case. It turned out there was another person involved in the group assault named Do-haeon. Eun-soo couldn't believe it. The name Do-haeon was the name of the remaining evil who had killed her son. This time, those two evils had committed the crime together. So seizing this opportunity, she was determined to get revenge for what happened 5 years ago. Unexpectedly, at that moment, a woman rushed in and slapped Eun-soo across the face. It turned out to be her former mother-in-law. She arrogantly blamed Eun-soo for her grandson's death, accusing her of not quitting her job to stay home and take care of the child, and saying that Eun-soo had ruined their family. Her son was finally preparing to marry a new wife, and now Eun-soo had reappeared and gotten involved with him again. Eun-soo didn't want to get involved with her, so she turned and left. She sat in a corner, listening to the insults, her heart feeling like it was being torn apart. After her son's tragic death, she still couldn't escape the haunting memory. Her house was empty, devoid of any life. A needle, though tiny, can pierce the heart with pain, and a tongue, though boneless, can inflict deep wounds. Her suffering, which lasted 5 years, stemmed from a cause that sounded like a joke. Moreover, in the eyes of those juvenile offenders, this case was truly just a joke. Her mother-in-law's outburst in court brought the truth of the 5-year-old case to light, and Judge Gi-hee also learned the truth. Coincidentally, she was the same judge who acquitted the two criminals back then. Yet, even now, she maintains that her verdict was entirely correct. She even stated that the outcome would have been the same if the case had been handed over to any other judge. Hearing this, Eun-soo couldn't help but question her. Who exactly is the law meant to serve? Is the law created to protect the victim or the perpetrator? If Gi-hee had given those two devils a proper punishment and warning back then, instead of hastily sentencing them in just 3 minutes, today's tragedy wouldn't have happened. That's why they learned absolutely nothing from the case, even believing themselves to be truly innocent. Seeing the loopholes in the law, they will continue to harm even more innocent people. Hearing this, Gi-hee clenched her fists. Of course, she knew Eun-soo wasn't wrong, but she still refused to admit her mistake. Gi-hee only used the excuse that Eun-soo had a blood relationship with the victim of the case from years ago to ask her not to interfere, but Eun-soo would never stop. She looked at Seo-na now, as if she were looking at her son from the past. She absolutely would not allow the absurd verdict of the past to repeat itself. Fortunately, Judge Tae-ju found a new clue in another sexual assault case. He happened to gather information from Do Haeon's victim, a young girl who was pregnant. According to her testimony, In-jun and Do Haeon had formed a criminal gang controlling many young, misguided girls. They specialized in scams and extortion at cheap motels, blackmailing customers under the guise of sexually assaulting young women. This tactic was practically foolproof. After each operation, the gang members made a lot of money. Some young girls, blinded by money, willingly joined the gang. But in the end, they realized they were just tools for making money. Not only did they not receive a single penny, but their lives were also threatened if they tried to escape. Therefore, they harbored resentment but dared not say a word. This girl, however, managed to escape after In-jun was arrested. After understanding the situation, Eun-soo acted quickly. She relentlessly searched for the girls being held captive by the criminal gang. This led to the discovery of even more horrific evidence of their crimes. It turned out that many girls had previously attempted to escape but failed, only to be captured by these beasts and subjected to repeated sexual abuse. Furthermore, they had filmed the entire process of the assault. They not only used these videos to force the girls into prostitution, but also freely traded them online. Soon, Eun-soo discovered Do Haeon's hideout. Taking advantage of the darkness and the absence of anyone, she quietly sneaked in, intending to seize all the incriminating evidence stored on their computer. But at that moment, a figure suddenly appeared behind her. He unexpectedly asked her who she was, if she was a police officer, and grinned. Eun-soo suddenly realized it was Do Haeon. At this point, Do Haeon's smile vanished. He was startled to recognize her as the woman from before. Then he lunged at Eun-soo, intending to hit her, asking if she knew how much the things on the computer were worth. As soon as he finished speaking, he slapped her. He showed absolutely no remorse for beating a woman old enough to be his mother. Eun-soo slowly stood up and asked him if, given the chance, he should have lived a decent life, at least ensuring one of the two children lived a decent life. Eun-soo couldn't understand why he could be so despicable. But despite Eun-soo's near collapse, Do Haeon maintained his composure, even grabbing her by the neck and asking who she was lecturing. Finally, he pulled out a knife, flipped Eun-soo over, and pressed the blade against her shoulder without hesitation, twisting the knife while asking her who she really was. Just as he was about to stab Eun-soo again, she managed to grab a brick nearby and smash it against Do Haeon's head. Eun-soo looked up at the shoe cabinet and discovered Seo-na's missing shoe at the scene of the assault. It turned out Do Haeon was indeed an accomplice in the gang assault. The display cabinet, filled with such shoes, covered an entire wall. There was no doubt that each shoe represented a victim. At that moment, Do Haeon stepped forward, confirming his presence at the scene. He smirked, challenging Eun-soo to do something if she knew the truth. Finally, he lunged at her, a murderous thought flashing through his mind. Just then, at that critical moment, the police suddenly called out. It turned out Eun-soo had contacted the criminal investigation team in charge of the case from the beginning. Seeing this, Do Haeon hastily fled the scene. However, he was quickly apprehended by the police, and all evidence of the crime was seized. Eun-soo refused treatment, her body covered in blood, and dragged herself back to the courthouse. She wanted to use her own body to change Judge Jeon-hee's verdict. She recounted the entirety of their crimes to the judge, describing everything they had done to the victims, from sexual assault to exploiting them for money. Seeing her in such pain and about to collapse, Judge Jeon-hee quickly told her to leave, urging her to go to the hospital before she called an ambulance. But Eun-soo endured the pain, desperately calling out to the judge. No matter how stern Judge Jeon-hee was, she was moved by this sight. A week later, the trial began. The malicious female lawyer continued to defend In-jun. She claimed that if Seo-na's body didn't contain In-jun's DNA, it couldn't be proven that he committed the crime. Furthermore, she presented a fabricated certificate of diligence, claiming that In-jun was a hardworking and helpful student, and that he was simply unlucky to be threatened by others. Therefore, he didn't disclose the details of what happened during the police investigation. She also presented photographs of In-jun's previous injuries as evidence. Similarly, Do Haeon and his companion immediately shifted all the blame onto their juniors, making them take the blame instead. Evidently, before the trial, the lawyer had carefully studied the judge's previous cases. Based on Judge Jeon-hee's previous swift and decisive handling of cases, it was highly likely that this case would also result in an acquittal, as in previous instances. However, Jeon-hee remembered Eun-soo's words, so she played the audio recording of the confessions from the two remaining juniors. It turned out that Tae-ju had successfully instigated them to betray their two seniors. If all the available evidence were used to reach a verdict, it was highly probable that Gong-soo and Dong-jeon would be found guilty and could face sentences exceeding 10 years. But if Gong-soo and Dong-jeon confessed now, it would be considered an act of atonement and their sentences could be reduced. After hearing this, Gong-soo and Dong-jeon had no choice but to confess everything. Dong-jeon asserted that everything was orchestrated by Do-hyun. Gong-soo continued by saying that if they disobeyed Do-hyun, he would beat them up, and added that Dong-jeon had also been abused by Do-hyun right in the courtroom. Upon hearing this, Do-hyun immediately showed his displeasure, and In-jun also began to get angry, seeing that the situation was getting out of hand. The defense lawyer hastily stood up to object, asserting that these words were merely a one-sided confession, completely lacking any direct evidence to prove it. But they couldn't have imagined that these two juniors had secretly prepared a way out for themselves. After each heist, both of them secretly copied all the evidence onto a USB drive. Judge Gyeon-hee immediately presented the incriminating evidence in court, leaving Do-hyun and In-jun unable to refute it. Do-hyun looked at each photographic evidence, recalling the scenes of them assaulting the victims, and then laughing and taking pictures as souvenirs. The victims' families, upon seeing these scenes, could only shed tears of resentment. But even at this point, Do-hyun still showed no remorse. When In-jun realized disaster was about to strike, his psychological defenses completely crumbled. He stood before the court and asserted that all his actions were orchestrated by Do-hyun. Hearing this, Do-hyun quickly refuted him. The two then engaged in a heated argument in the middle of the courtroom, eventually resorting to violence, completely denying the judge any opportunity to question them. They vied with each other to accuse the other of crimes. Since both In-jun and Do-hyun proved themselves to be the culprits, Judge Gyeon-hee didn't want to waste any more words on them. She wanted the victim, Son-ah, who was listening from outside, to conclude the trial. In truth, Son-ah initially didn't want to testify. She felt she had no face left to live, and had even contemplated suicide many times. However, In-soo advised her that the people who should feel the most ashamed in the world are those criminals, including In-jun and Do-hyun's gang, as well as the scum who like to hurl insults online. They were the ones most deserving of condemnation. If the victim did something reckless, it would only make them more arrogant. Only when Son-ah herself stepped into court for trial could she hold her head high and live confidently. Therefore, Son-ah bravely spoke up in court. Trembling, she said, "Please, let my life go back to how it was before." That sentence seemed to have used up all the courage of her life, and as soon as she finished speaking, she couldn't hold back her tears. Her sobs echoed through the courtroom, causing everyone to feel heartbroken, except for the two perpetrators. In the end, In-jun and Do-hyun were sentenced to 20 years in prison. Although the trial was full of twists and turns, this outcome can be considered complete. However, the pain they left behind will never disappear, and the victim will have to live with that pain for the rest of her life. For example, In-soo had lived like a soulless shell for years, even though the murderer of her son had been punished. But the deep-seated longing in her heart finally erupted completely. Looking at each of her son's belongings, she burst into heart-wrenching sobs, her heart aching as if it were being torn apart. After looking at her son's photo one last time, In-soo took all the belongings to the memorial house for the final time, then burned everything to send her a message to her son in heaven. Her life had to go on. After this incident, In-soo seemed to have no more worries. She immersed herself in her work prosecuting juvenile offenders. The very next day, In-soo received a case that shocked the nation. A 13-year-old boy lured an 8-year-old boy into his house. After brutally murdering him, he dismembered the body and dumped the remains on the rooftop late at night. Strangely, after committing the crime, he ran to the police station and confessed, saying he had killed the boy. Upon hearing this, the police were extremely surprised. Then, the boy pulled out a kite covered in blood and claimed he committed the crime alone. Based on his description, the police quickly found the victim on the rooftop and immediately arrested the perpetrator. The teenager, named Song-woo, lived in the same building as the 8-year-old victim. Moreover, the two had never even met and had no prior animosity. This was a classic case of intentional malicious intent. The case quickly spread and attracted public attention. Because Song-woo was under 14 years old, under South Korea's juvenile protection law, he would be exempt from criminal responsibility, at most sent to a reformatory for 2 years. This immediately sparked public outrage, with many protesting, demanding the repeal of the juvenile protection law and calling for the perpetrator to be punished severely, a life for a life. Late at night, In-soo was reading documents about Song-woo and discovered that he had dropped out of high school and had a criminal record for multiple intentional assaults. Song-woo lived in a single-parent family and suffered from severe emotional dissociative disorder, requiring medication to maintain his composure. This could very well be the reason he escaped punishment. Sure enough, In-soo's guess was correct. According to Song-woo's testimony, on that day, his illness suddenly relapsed, causing him to panic. Just then, the boy came to borrow his phone. Song-woo tried to stay calm and took the boy home, but because children are playful and the house was full of toys, the boy stayed for a long time. He even insisted that Songwoo play with him. Annoyed, Songwoo finally lost his temper and conceived the idea of murder. He lunged at the boy, shoved him aside, and told him to play hide and seek. "If I don't find you, you have to hide somewhere. If you come out or I find you, I'll kill you." Terrified, the boy hid under the bed but was eventually caught by Songwoo. After a burst of gleeful laughter, he began to commit the crime. Not only that, he gleefully recounted the entire incident in court, leaving everyone horrified and enraged. Knowing he was underage and therefore not criminally responsible, his attitude was incredibly defiant. His lack of fear or remorse infuriated everyone present. It wasn't until the court adjourned that Songwoo's mother arrived, but she didn't come to apologize. Instead, she immediately invoked the juvenile protection law, demanding leniency. Eun-soo angrily stood up, demanding that she apologize to the victim's family first before discussing anything else. Then, the victim's mother also arrived at the court. Seeing her tearful face, Eun-soo was moved, her own eyes welling up with tears. The mother had no other demands. She only hoped the culprit would receive a fitting punishment. Knowing the court's limitations, she cooked some of her son's favorite dishes and brought them to Eun-soo. That night, Eun-soo took out the meal and savored it carefully. At this moment, the responsibility on her shoulders seemed to weigh even heavier. She stayed up all night studying the documents. The next day, Songwoo appeared in court again. Facing the judge's questions, he became increasingly impatient, seemingly only wanting to quickly escape conviction. So he presented his medical records to prove his case, claiming his schizophrenia had worsened. He had both a mental illness and was not yet 14 years old. Songwoo appeared extremely confident, as if he had victory in his grasp. But when Eun-soo saw this, she sneered, looked straight into Songwoo's eyes, and asked, "You're not the culprit, are you?" It turned out that the night before, while reading the documents, she had discovered an anomaly. This is schizoaffective disorder, often presenting with symptoms such as auditory and visual hallucinations. Normally, someone with this disorder would be incapable of performing such complex actions alone, nor would they be able to maintain concentration. Therefore, it's even more impossible to talk about the actions required after murder, such as cleaning up the crime scene. Furthermore, the perpetrator is capable of meticulously erasing evidence, something even adults might struggle with. Yet, Songwoo not only dismembered the body and cleaned up the crime scene, but even disposed of the remains himself. This suggests a third party was involved, and that person is the true perpetrator. Songwoo, under 14 years old, acting so arrogantly, certainly indicates premeditated collusion and a deliberate attempt to confess. This wasn't just Eun-soo's speculation. She had checked the elevator security camera at the crime scene and found evidence of a third party, a female student named John. Upon hearing this, Songwoo immediately lost his composure, shouting that it wasn't her, that she had absolutely nothing to do with the incident. However, Songwoo's panic only further confirmed Eun-soo's suspicions. The court also collected the two's call history as evidence and discovered that he had been in close contact with John before the crime. Seeing this, Songwoo tried to snatch back the photo, even though he hadn't confessed a single word. But the truth was eventually revealed. Songwoo was arrested and taken to the prosecutor's office. Later, Eun-soo asked Taiju to go to the police station to retrieve the surveillance camera footage, and discovered that when Songwoo came to confess, he was constantly looking in one direction, and the person standing opposite the police at that time was Jeon. To catch her, Taiju initially went to see Jeon's old classmate, learning that she went to the internet cafe every night and often stayed there all night. Having grasped the situation, Eun-soo decided to act immediately that night. Unexpectedly, she was stopped by Songwoo's mother, who, in a desperate manner, demanded that Eun-soo release her son. But even the most pitiable can sometimes be hateful. If simply begging or threatening could get a criminal acquitted, Eun-soo's work would be meaningless. She didn't want to explain further and decisively sped away. Soon, Eun-soo arrived at the internet cafe and found John, revealing her identity. John then stood up, seemingly cooperating, but at a fork in the road, she suddenly broke free and tried to escape. After a fierce chase, John was finally cornered in a narrow dead-end alley. Eun-soo looked at her with an expressionless face and cold eyes. Her eyes clearly showed intense hatred, enough to send shivers down the spine of any juvenile offender. John had dropped out of school in the 10th grade. Her parents were busy with their business and didn't want to waste time, so they spent a large sum of money hiring a lawyer to defend Jeon. This incident shows that behind a misguided teenager, there are often irresponsible parents. Despite Eun-soo's sharp questioning, John maintained an innocent expression and refused to speak. Because her lawyer had instructed her to exercise her right to remain silent, she remained quiet until the chat history was presented. Having no other choice, Eun-soo had to show the surveillance video from the day of the incident and ask why John was at the crime scene. At this point, John began to panic, her hands clenched, her eyes darting back and forth. She slowly replied that she had only shared an elevator with Song-woo, even innocently asking if that was considered a crime. Although John refused to plead guilty, the fact remained that she had been present at the crime scene. Therefore, Eun-soo used the reason that John was a serious suspect in the case to request her temporary detention. However, John's lawyer quickly devised a counter-strategy. The very next day, she hired someone to manipulate public opinion to tarnish the court's reputation, simultaneously releasing information that Judge Eun-soo had forcibly detained a minor and accusing her of seriously violating normal investigative procedures. Furthermore, they claimed that Eun-soo had a biased and negative view of juvenile offenders, even asserting that she was unfit to be a judge of the juvenile court. Upon hearing this news, the chief judge of the juvenile court immediately flew into a rage. But Eun-soo was not afraid at all. She even strongly argued that at least the court had to uncover the truth. Wasn't that the duty of law enforcement officers like them? What if, after the trial, the juvenile offender still couldn't understand the law and its values? And what should law enforcement officers do in such situations? If these juvenile offenders become even more wicked and harm more people after they grow up, who will be held responsible? Eun-soo asserted that they had to let these juvenile offenders know how terrifying the law was and that they needed to be educated about the consequences of harming others. If parents felt sorry for their children and wanted to protect them, then the family needed to cooperate with the court. Eun-soo believed this was the reason she was standing there. She also questioned the chief judge, asking him what she had done wrong. As a judge, what heinous crime had she ultimately committed? Faced with Eun-soo's righteous and sharp questions, the chief judge could only remain silent. Of course, he knew that what Eun-soo said was true, but he didn't want the court to suffer a reputational blow, thus damaging the prestige of the judicial system. But justice lies within each individual. Reputation isn't built solely on online discussions, but on fair and transparent trials and judgments. Eun-soo expressed that she would never easily forgive any juvenile offender. Afterward, she called Tae-ju to visit Song-woo's mother, informing her that there was a third-party party present at the scene. If she could persuade her son to confess, he would certainly receive leniency. From the first glance, Song-woo's mother recognized Jeon. Although she didn't quite believe it, but for her son's sake, she decided to agree. Not long after, the trial date arrived, and as expected, Song-woo had completely changed. Standing before the court, Song-woo stated that everything was done on Jaeun's instructions. On the day of the crime, Jaeun had kidnapped the boy and taken him to her house. Ultimately, Jaeun was the one who murdered the victim. He only provided the location of the crime. Furthermore, he was completely unaware of the tragic event. Upon witnessing Jaeun's murder, Song-woo was so horrified he couldn't believe it and called her insane. He didn't know what to do, but Jaeun insisted that they were both accomplices and that both could continue living after hearing his testimony. Jaeun never expected Song-woo to betray her. However, the lawyer, having prepared for the situation, maintained his initial argument, claiming that Jaeun suffered from a severe delusional disorder. Her doctor also testified in court. More precisely, this delusional disorder is also known as persecutory delusion. Patients are completely unable to control their words and actions. Even a minor incident in life can trigger a relapse. When unable to control their anger, they may harm others, making her motive for the crime difficult to determine. If Jaeun was in a delusional state at the time of the crime, there would be no way to convict her. However, there is another crucial question. Jaeun's delusional disorder and Song-woo's schizoaffective disorder share a common characteristic. They are absolutely incapable of dismembering the body and cleaning up the crime scene. So who actually did those things? At this point, Jaeun suddenly called out Song-woo's name and said that Song-woo was the one who asked her to do it. He stood outside the restroom and showed her how to dismember the victim, teaching her to put the body parts into garbage bags to dispose of the corpse. Then she climbed onto the water tank on the rooftop to throw away those garbage bags, all at Song-woo's coercion. Song-woo, upon hearing this, shouted, saying that Jaeun had done it herself. At that time, she had said she wouldn't be caught on camera, clearly lying. According to him, everything was Jaeun's doing. He insisted he wasn't wrong, but Jaeun continued to sob, saying that he had stood outside the restroom and instructed her to do everything. But Song-woo claimed that he only did it because Jaeun suggested it. He had wanted to turn himself in, but Jaeun stubbornly refused. Then Jaeun immediately denied Song-woo's statements. Song-woo insisted that she had personally chosen the kite. After killing the boy, she even excitedly danced. Jaeun continued to accuse Song-woo of falsely accusing someone. The two kept blaming each other. At this moment, the victim's mother suddenly shouted, telling them both to shut up. Her face was filled with anguish, begging them to stop talking. Whether it was a paranoid delusion or a schizophrenic disorder, it didn't matter to the victim's parents. She only knew that her son had been lured to their home by a stranger and ultimately died in pain and despair without his mother by his side. Just thinking about it, the mother couldn't suppress her grief. She immediately pleaded with all the judges and the chief judge in court. court, asking them not to let this heartbreaking tragedy happen again and to severely punish the perpetrator. The entire courtroom fell silent. Not a sound could be heard except for the mother's heart-wrenching cries. The chief judge announced a recess. After deliberation with his colleagues, the chief judge decided to follow Eun-soo's wishes, sentencing Jaeon to 20 years in prison, while Song-woo would be sent to a juvenile reformatory for 2 years. Upon hearing the verdict, Jaeon screamed, demanding a retrial. Unable to understand why she had to be imprisoned for 20 years, she became enraged, cursing and hitting everyone, causing a disturbance in front of the court. Meanwhile, Song-woo bowed his head, his face filled with remorse. Everyone understood that children like Jen seemed completely beyond redemption. Even after 20 years in prison, she would likely continue to be a bad person in society. This was an unavoidable aspect of the law, but at least the court was still trying to fulfill its original function. While it's impossible to change the nature of juvenile offenders, the blame shouldn't be placed entirely on the law. If parents had properly educated their children, such heartbreaking tragedies wouldn't have occurred. Just look at the fact that Jaeon's parents didn't show up until the day of the trial. That's enough to show what kind of people they are. If parents don't try to educate their children, they will never change. Going back to the time before the incident, Jaeon was sitting alone when a boy approached, patted her on the shoulder, and asked to borrow her phone to call his mother. After hearing the boy call his mother, a look of shock briefly appeared on Jaeon's face, suggesting that there was something unusual about her relationship with her mother. Perhaps from that moment, evil thoughts began to arise in Jaeon's mind. After the trial, Song-woo's mother went to see Judge Tae-ju and said that since he had clearly promised leniency, her son should be released immediately. Finally, Eun-soo couldn't hold back and spoke up, saying that the sentence for Song-woo was already very light. If she was dissatisfied, she could appeal, and Eun-soo would carefully consider how many years of imprisonment Song-woo should receive. Eun-soo then told her there's an idiom called heartbreaking pain, referring to the pain parents feel when they lose a child. So, what had she done for Song-woo when he was 9 years old? The victim in this case was also only 9 years old, and his mother had permanently lost her child. It was all because of her son. Eun-soo's words deeply moved Song-woo's mother. It wasn't until she returned home late at night and saw the bloodstains on the floor that she truly felt the pain. The crimes committed can never be erased, and now it's too late for regrets. The nationwide dismemberment murder case may have ended here, but that doesn't mean everything is over. Will those juvenile criminals truly repent for their crimes? Will they re-offend during their time in rehabilitation? No one can guarantee that. The next day, the court unexpectedly received a phone call accusing the juvenile detention center of embezzling funds and mistreating children. Upon receiving this news, Eun-soo and Tae-ju immediately went to the center to investigate. They questioned several young girls, and the results horrified them. Each of them had been mistreated to varying degrees. For example, at mealtimes, the director would give them stale rice, while the fresh rice was cooked separately for her daughter. If anyone dared to complain about eating spoiled rice, she would throw their bowl to the ground and scold them, saying that girls like them didn't even have enough to eat at home, yet they dared to be picky. Then she would immediately refuse them their food. The girls could only bow their heads, apologize, promise to be more polite in the future, and beg her to let them eat. But she would retort, "Aren't you full already? If you're full, go rest." The girl continued to cry and apologize, but she was met with a furious scolding, told not to cry because it would only bring her bad luck. If she dared to cry again, she wouldn't be merciful. Then the manager immediately ordered the girl upstairs. Not only that, they were also forced to go to people's homes in the area to do housework to earn extra income. Anyone who dared to resist was brutally beaten. One girl even suffered a broken bone and had to be hospitalized. She's still in the hospital bed. Although these juvenile delinquents were brought here for rehabilitation, the treatment was truly outrageous. Eun-soo and Tae-ju immediately investigated the reformatory's records all night, quickly finding evidence that the director had embezzled funding. The next day, they summoned her for questioning, but unexpectedly, she told a story completely contrary to the juvenile delinquents' statements. She had diligently cared for them all this time, but the girls were never satisfied. They constantly demanded to smoke cigarettes during meals, and after being refused their outrageous request, they cursed at her and smashed dishes on the table. She asked them what they intended to do, wondering if they didn't appreciate the food. Then one of the girls retorted angrily, asking if she was implying that girls like them, who didn't even have enough to eat at home, were now being picky. The woman told them not to look at her like that, because her patience had its limits. Hearing this, the other girl declared she wouldn't eat anymore, kicked her chair, and left. The woman angrily scolded her, saying she shouldn't eat anymore, that she had no right to eat. At this point, the director's daughter, Kim A, stood up and said, "What's all this commotion so early in the morning?" The other girls mimicked Kim A's words and burst into laughter, while the director didn't dare do anything to them. Finally, she could only silently clean up the mess on the floor. As for having to do housework for the local people, there was actually a reason for it. When this juvenile detention center was first built, it faced fierce opposition from the local residents. Everyone agrees that juvenile delinquency shouldn't exist in their neighborhood. Therefore, to mend relations with the local people, the director personally led them to people's homes to help with chores, and even organized group activities to change people's prejudices. But they still ganged up, bullying those who were truly repentant and trying to reform, even going so far as to break someone's leg. To verify the director's testimony, Yoon-soo called the girls into her office and then made a phone call to the hospital. Finally, the truth became clear. Indeed, kindness cannot reform evil. Juvenile criminals like them must be severely punished, making them fear the law from the bottom of their hearts. Afterwards, Yoon-soo visited the injured girl at the hospital and only then learned that the director's embezzlement of the funding was not for personal gain, but to pay for her hospital bills. She was still too optimistic about juvenile delinquency, because if this were exposed to the public, they would be punished by law again. That's why the director secretly embezzled public funds. The girl said that after being discharged from the hospital, she would work hard to repay the money and begged Yoon-soo not to close the reformatory, because she truly considered it her home and also considered the director like her own mother. Because after going to the reformatory, she knew what it felt like to be loved, to have someone put food in her bowl. She told herself that after her time in rehabilitation, she would definitely live a decent life, and she also set a new goal for her life: to repay the director's kindness. After realizing she had misunderstood the director, Yoon-soo immediately drove to the reformatory that night. But when she arrived, she only saw a pile of messy belongings, seemingly indicating that a fight had taken place there. Furthermore, the whereabouts of both the juvenile offenders and the director are unknown, leaving only the director's daughter, Kim-ae, behind. Yoon-soo immediately asked the girl what had happened, and Kim-ae said that her mother had just been taken away by ambulance. Yoon-soo couldn't believe it. It turned out that when the director learned the juvenile detention center was about to close, he was so shocked that he fainted on the spot. Because of this, Kim-ae became extremely agitated, believing that her mother had been harmed by those juvenile delinquents. She even thought that her inability to see her father was also because of them. Her mother told her that her father had been sent abroad for work and couldn't return, but it was all a lie, because her parents had divorced a long time ago. It was only because of this place, because of this worthless juvenile detention center. It was all because of those delinquent girls. A few days ago, her younger sister had severe menstrual cramps and even had to be taken to the hospital, but her mother still didn't go to pick her up because, compared to her own daughter lying in the hospital room, feeding those delinquent girls seemed more important. Every time, she prioritized others over her own daughter. Only now did Yoon-soo learn the truth. It turned out that the phone call reporting the crime wasn't from the juvenile delinquents, but from Kim-ae, who for her mother's sake wanted to use this as an excuse to close the juvenile detention center. Fortunately, the director wasn't in any serious trouble, but the juvenile delinquents had taken the opportunity to escape together. Now free, the seeds of crime hidden deep within them were about to erupt. Everyone immediately rushed to the nearest police station to report the crime, then split into groups to search for them. Unexpectedly, at this moment, a girl suddenly contacted them. It turned out she was one of the escaped juvenile delinquents. She said that there was a girl named Jang-na who forced all the other girls to sell sex at the motel to make money. The call was interrupted when Jang-na suddenly appeared and grabbed her. Upon receiving this news, Yoon-soo's group immediately launched an operation. However, the girl was already locked in her rented room, while Jang-na stood guard downstairs. The girl wanted to use this opportunity to escape, but unexpectedly, a man entered the room at that moment. Without saying a word, he immediately locked the door with a chain. The girl asked him what he was doing and why he locked the door. He turned around and calmly said that there were too many people these days who took the money and ran away, so he had to be cautious. While the man was showering, the girl quickly opened his backpack to look for the key. To her horror, she almost screamed because the backpack contained only those terrifying things and nothing else. Not even a wallet had a single penny. The girl had no choice but to try to unlock the man's phone to call the police. But at that moment, the sound of running water in the bathroom suddenly stopped. The woman was then assaulted by the man. He thought she was playing a prank on him, so he repeatedly beat her and accused her of trying to swindle him out of money. Fortunately, Yoon-soo arrived with the police and began searching the room. They checked each room in turn. In another room, the woman smashed a bottle of wine and threatened to slit her own throat with the shards. She warned him that if he took another step, she would kill herself and he would surely go to jail. But the man seemed unfazed, thinking she was just trying to trick him, and calmly said, "Go ahead if you dare." there. Just then, a voice from outside the door announced, "The police are investigating a case. Please cooperate." Hearing this, the woman immediately screamed for help. Seeing his wicked act about to be exposed, the man became enraged and tried to strangle her. Just at this critical moment, the police outside heard strange noises coming from the room and immediately broke down the door. The man tried to jump out the window to escape but was immediately apprehended by the police. Finally, all the other girls were found and brought out, but Jong-na was nowhere to be seen. After questioning the girls, the police learned that Kim-A knew Jong-na had very deep feelings for her mother. Therefore, that night, when talking to her, Kim-A lied, saying that Jong-na's mother was critically ill. So Eun-soo and the director immediately went to Jong-na's mother's residence. Sure enough, they quickly found Jong-na sitting on the stairs, her face smeared with dirt, looking very unwell. It turned out that she had indeed returned there to find her mother the night before. But her mother was not critically ill at all. Not only had she found new happiness, but she also utterly detested Jong-na. Even though she was her biological daughter, Jong-na grew up in a family where her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother abandoned her early in life, leaving her deprived of affection. She envied children who grew up surrounded by their parents' love. Her mother's cold attitude made her unable to control her emotions, turning love into hatred. She frantically banged on the door, calling for her mother to come out. A man opened the door and asked who she was. Jong-na desperately tried to storm into the house, but the man stopped her and cursed her as a madwoman. Her mother watched helplessly as her daughter was beaten by her lover, not saying a word, even turning a blind eye. Children who have suffered such deep trauma often tend to self-harm and are more likely to commit crimes or associate with thugs, eventually becoming criminals herself. In fact, they knew from the beginning that their actions were wrong, but they still deliberately committed the crime because they hoped that the pain of self-harm would also make their loved ones feel hurt. The other girls, and Kim-A as well, were the same. Their purpose was simple. They just wanted to attract the attention of adults, to let them know their pain, hoping that adults wouldn't ignore them. But the results were not as they hoped. In reality, most criminal behavior stems from family circumstances. The court or reformatory can only play a supporting role. The biggest cause of juvenile delinquency remains the lack of love, and this problem will probably never be solved. Parents who have failed their whole lives only gain absolute authority over their children after a long time. So some adults simply don't know how to love others. Eun-soo hopes that the director will learn a lesson from this case and not wait until his own daughter becomes a juvenile offender before regretting it. After calming down, the director returned home with her daughter. She called her name, then walked over and hugged her daughter's shoulders, saying, "I'm so tired. Let me hug you." Her daughter smiled happily but still seemed a little sulky. Thanks to this, the director and her daughter understood each other better, and their mother-daughter bond gradually strengthened. Meanwhile, at the juvenile court, after a discussion during the break, they decided to continue operating the reformatory, but the group bullying and Jong-na's case could not be overlooked. The next day, the juvenile offenders were gathered to hear their sentences. Each of them was sent to stricter juvenile reformatories for rehabilitation. Moreover, this time their parents also had to participate in the education alongside their children, especially Jong-na's parents. The guardians all bowed their heads, sitting together in the back, looking extremely ashamed. But ultimately, were they ashamed of their children or ashamed of not having raised them properly? That's hard to say. Looking at how they were sitting in court, perhaps most of them didn't even really have a concept of shame. Finally, the verdict was delivered. At the same time, the chief judge summoned the chief judge of the juvenile division to his office. It turned out that a recent exam leak had occurred at a high school, and moreover the students there were all from elite backgrounds. Among them were quite a few children of influential political figures and people working in various ministries and departments. This was an extremely difficult case involving a large number of people, so the chief judge decided to entrust the entire case to the chief judge. The chief judge accepted and said that after completing this case, he would resign to enter politics. It turned out that he had always dreamed of reforming the laws applied to juvenile offenders, a dream he could only achieve if he became a member of parliament, and this case would be his last. The chief judge was extremely confident, but unexpectedly, just as he stepped out the door, he received a call from the police. His son was so frightened that he didn't dare open the door. It turned out that his son was also involved in the exam leak. Thinking of the promises he had made to the chief judge returned home furious. Fortunately, the police didn't come because of the exam leak, but only to investigate a recent traffic accident. The chief judge was so angry that he threw and smashed things. Clearly, he had forbidden the mother and son from getting involved in this matter. The mother quickly insisted that her son had only participated once and wouldn't participate again, and that many others had also been involved. Only the principal knows the list. If If so many people violate the rules at the same time, it's unlikely they'll get away with it. But at this moment, the whole society was focused on this matter, and the chief judge understood very well that things were not as simple as they seemed. If the matter were exposed, his son's future and his own career would be over. The chief judge angrily questioned his son, asking why he had disobeyed his warnings about the extreme danger and forbade his participation. He felt utterly helpless, seemingly giving up as there was no way to salvage the situation. Meanwhile, the mother, realizing the seriousness of the matter, began wailing in anguish, believing she had ruined the futures of both her husband and son. The next day, the leaked exam questions were published in the news. The chief judge's involvement in politics was also revealed, but his son, Shinju, not wanting to tarnish his father's reputation, ran to the police station to prepare to turn himself in. Late that evening, after the chief judge had dinner with the council members, he received a call from the police. It turned out that Shinju had been in a serious accident while crossing the road and was severely injured, currently in the emergency room. Seeing his son unconscious and his wife sobbing beside him, the chief judge felt utterly empty. He suddenly remembered how he had once scolded his son, telling him that if he wanted to die, he should die by himself and not drag others down with him. His wife said it was all his fault. It turned out that the chief judge had always compared Shinju to his second son, scolding him for being so incompetent, always ranking last despite being the judge's son, which made him feel incredibly ashamed. Because of this, Shinju felt immense pressure to gain his father's approval, so he studied incredibly hard every day, but his grades didn't improve at all. At that moment, the school learned he was the judge's son and proactively invited him to participate in the exam leak, which led to his only mistake. But ever since that incident, Shinju felt deeply ashamed and withdrew from the race. After all, he was still a good child. It's just that the chief judge had never understood that before. Eventually, he realized his mistake and went to see the congressman to withdraw from the election. However, he was refused, as such incidents are commonplace for Korean politicians, even considered minor matters. If he withdrew, the media would relentlessly pursue him, so the congressman urged him to quickly resolve the issue. The chief judge then secretly met with the person in charge of the leaked exam and told him to firmly deny all accusations in court the next day. Initially, the person in charge didn't understand what was happening. It wasn't until the day of the verdict, after seeing the chief judge preside over the trial, that he finally understood. Not only did the students in the school deny their guilt, but even the parents claimed that exam leaks were commonplace. One parent stood up and explained that in the past, getting into Seoul National University only required diligent studying, but now, if a child wants to get into Seoul National University, it's impossible to pass just by studying at school. Therefore, parents are forced to spend money, even a lot of money, to hire graduate students to tutor their children. Then the children have to go through dozens, even hundreds of exams at the school to assess and evaluate their abilities. Hearing this parent's words, Eun-soo was surprised. If it's so troublesome, why not just refuse and let the children study normally? But the parents continued to explain that the university entrance exam is like a battlefield, and they agreed to the offer because they wanted what was best for their children. If she disagreed, other children would take her son's place on the scoreboard. Even a difference of 1 or 2 points could make a huge difference, from 1 good to 10 good. This parent also emphasized that the children receiving the test answers wasn't because they were poor students, but because they needed time to review other subjects, preparing for the fierce battle of the university entrance exam. The parent's words left everyone in court speechless. However, the parent became increasingly angry, even asking the judge when the case would end, as her son still had to attend extra classes. Clearly, they still felt no guilt in this matter. Finally, the chief judge quickly ended the preliminary hearing, even using his authority to release all the witnesses. This left Eun-soo utterly bewildered. She had only asked one question, yet the chief judge immediately became furious. He even scolded her for her lack of restraint, saying that if she continued acting like this, he would resign. This made Eun-soo realize something was amiss. A few days later, the trial resumed. Unexpectedly, a student revealed a crucial clue. He had overheard the principal calling the person in charge, stating that a total of 24 students were involved in the exam leak, but the number ultimately dropped to 21, meaning 3 students had slipped through the net. However, he couldn't hear their specific names. Undoubtedly, those 3 students were the children of council members or other people in positions of power. Even among them were children with excellent academic records, because judging from the parents' previous statements, these students participated in the exam leak not to achieve high scores, but simply to save time on extra tutoring, or they may have withdrawn from the matter midway. From this clue, Eun-soo began tracing the list and eventually found 6 students who fit the criteria. Sure enough, she discovered the name Shinju, the son of the chief judge, on that list. It seemed her guess was correct, but there was still no concrete evidence. By the third court session, the chief judge seemed even more impatient, declaring that he would expedite the trial and refusing all requests to summon witnesses. The prosecutor argued that there was no reasonable reason to refuse such important witnesses, but the chief judge stubbornly refused. Finally, Eun-soo could no longer bear it and declared a temporary suspension of the trial, even claiming that because the chief judge was not following proper procedure, a 1-hour pause was needed for reorganization. This decision surprised everyone. Afterwards, she was reprimanded by the chief judge for overstepping her authority, but Eun-soo still resolutely revealed the matter concerning Shin-ju. The chief judge was clearly hit where it hurt. He loudly rebuked Eun-soo, saying there was no evidence and even threatened her. He said that if she relied solely on speculation and assumptions, he would retaliate in any way possible. The two parted ways in disagreement. Unexpectedly, the very next day, Eun-soo reported the entire incident to the chief judge. Seeing this, the chief judge tried to defend himself, but Eun-soo presented the evidence. It turned out that she had visited Shin-ju the previous day after he had woken up. In fact, the boy had intended to turn himself in that day, but suddenly felt that doing so would affect his father, so he did something foolish instead. He thought that if he died first, everything would be over. Eun-soo convinced him that everyone makes mistakes in life, but the important thing is how we correct those mistakes afterward. Her words had a profound impact on Shin-ju, and he eventually confessed everything. Eun-soo then presented the evidence in front of everyone, leaving the chief judge speechless. The chief justice gave him a day to sort things out and resign voluntarily. But that doesn't mean the chief judge was a bad person. His goal was to enter politics to reform juvenile law, and he wanted to achieve justice through a flawed approach. This is a typical manifestation of utilitarianism. Whether utilitarianism is right or wrong must be viewed from the dark side of idealism. The result of idealism is forcing a person capable of developing the judicial system to resign, causing public doubt about the court's credibility, and pushing a previously stable organization into a deadlock. If everyone were forced to be perfect without any mistakes or flaws, then everyone would have to self-reflect. Ultimately, in this society, everyone would only live for themselves, and no one would dare to speak up for justice. But justice will eventually prevail, because any system needs good people and capable people working together to achieve greater effectiveness. Currently, a capable person like Judge Min has had to entrust the task of legal reform to a good person like Eun-soo. As the final trial took place, he quietly left. Only Judge Tae-ju came to see him off, and in doing so, produced a photograph. It turned out that he too had once been a juvenile delinquent and was one of many who had received help from Judge Min. He began recounting his first day in office, when the chief judge also said that he had recognized him from the first time he met him, and that he was extremely grateful that he had become such a good person. At that moment, Judge Tae-ju bent down to tie Judge Min's shoelaces, just as he had done years ago when he was a juvenile delinquent. The judge's demeanor at that time was unforgettable, and he seemed to always remember every kind act of help the judge had given him. The two said their final emotional farewells. The judge reminded him to absolutely follow the path of justice, not to make the same mistakes he had, and then he departed. Judge Tae-ju bowed to Judge Min one last time to show his respect and reverence. Before leaving, Judge Min left Eun-soo a letter. In it, he said that he didn't actually hate her, only that he was sometimes a little angry, but he believed that Eun-soo's words were not wrong, and her actions were even less so. He hopes Eun-soo can continue to be a good judge, and also hopes she can complete her unfinished career, perhaps implementing legal reforms for juvenile offenders in the future. As for the final outcome, only time and fate will decide. Just like the current juvenile justice system in South Korea, no one can offer a perfect solution. But before finding such a solution, legal leniency sometimes equates to condoning crime. Because the behavior of minors is easily influenced by external factors, they are like a polluted pool of water, unable to clean itself. If society cannot punish them, then the law must be used. And Eun-soo will be the judge who uses the law to do just that. The film ends here. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and see you again.